When a person becomes spiritually awake, their life doesn't explode overnight, it dissolves slowly. One by one, the habits, desires, and illusions that once defined them begin to fall away. Carl Jung said awakening is not about adding more, but shedding what no longer belongs. The real question is, are you willing to let go of the very things that keep you asleep? This process you describe, this slow quitting, is a profound and essential movement in the journey toward psychological and spiritual wholeness, a core theme in the work of Carl Jung. It is the beginning of individuation, the process by which a person becomes a whole, distinct, and unique individual, moving from a collective state to a state of self-realization. It's a realization that hits not with a bang, but with a growing, inescapable discomfort. The life you've built, seemingly of your own design, is in fact a structure of inherited beliefs and borrowed expectations. The masks you've worn, the persona in Jungian terms, are no longer protective, they are suffocating. You are not depressed, you are experiencing an awakening, a psychological and spiritual emergency where your true self is rejecting its prison of inauthenticity. Jung spent his life documenting the transformations of the soul, observing that genuine spiritual growth is rarely about grand, sudden declarations. Instead, it is a gradual, almost involuntary shedding, a slow and sometimes agonizing release of patterns that once felt like survival mechanisms but now register as a deep, soul-level allergic reaction to the inauthentic. Here is an expansion on the 7 things Jung observed highly individuated people slowly quit as they awaken, moving from conscious effort to an effortless state of being. The 7 involuntary quits of the awakening soul. 1. The desperate hunger for approval. The first thing to crumble is the desperate hunger for approval. This isn't a conscious decision to be defiant, it's a shift in the deepest psychological structure that makes approval-seeking feel physically uncomfortable. The shift: you've spent a lifetime consuming the sugar of external validation. As yourself, Jung's term for your authentic, complete core, begins to emerge from the confines of the ego, you realize the self doesn't need external validation because it is inherently complete. The approval you once craved suddenly makes you sick. The manifestation: the body literally rebels. You find yourself in a situation where you're about to contort your personality to please someone, a mother, a boss, a social group, and a sudden, inexplicable nausea or stuckness takes over. The words for the performance get trapped. Jung's patients described it as an emergency brake applied by the soul. The outcome: the goal is not arrogance, but inner authority. As the addiction to approval dies, an unshakable sense of inner worth is born. This is not confidence, which still references others, it is worth, which references only itself. 2. The compulsion to be special. The second quit is often counterintuitive, the need to be special. Early in an awakening, the ego can seize the experience and inflate, creating a sense of spiritual inflation, the feeling of being chosen, superior, or more conscious than the unconscious masses. The shift: the performance of specialness begins to feel heavy, false, and exhausting, like a costume that used to feel like wings but now feels like chains. You realize you are using spirituality itself as a strategy to elevate your ego. This is the opposite of spiritual freedom. The manifestation: you begin to catch yourself before dropping hints about your spiritual practices, synchronicities, or deep insights. The desire to differentiate yourself from others, to be the wise one, simply dissipates. The outcome: you become truly unique by quitting the need to be seen as unique. Jung called this individuation without inflation. When you stop performing your specialness, your genuine, idiosyncratic nature naturally shines through. You become comfortable being ordinary, realizing that, just being you, is, in fact, everything. You become like a flower that blooms for the sake of blooming, whether anyone is watching or not. 3. The performance of happiness. Genuine spiritual development doesn't make a person perpetually happy, it makes them perpetually real. The third quit is the most difficult to shed in a culture obsessed with positivity, the performance of happiness. The shift: the spiritual community often pressures people into spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts or affirmations to avoid the full spectrum of human emotions, grief, anger, doubt, and sorrow. As you become whole, the soul demands full embodiment. The manifestation: you can no longer force a smile or spout a positive affirmation when your inner experience is sorrow or turmoil. A therapist Jung supervised, for instance, found herself unable to maintain her enlightened healer persona after a personal tragedy. Tears simply fell, an authentic release that was more healing than any wisdom she could have manufactured. The outcome: you move from spiritual bypass to spiritual embodiment. Reality includes the shadow, the dark, denied, and unacknowledged parts of the self. By quitting the need to appear perpetually light and loving, you reclaim your full humanity, allowing for genuine joy and authentic sorrow to coexist. 4. The desperate need for certainty. The mind's ultimate defense mechanism is the need for certainty, the desperate grip on knowing, understanding, and having answers. The fourth quid is often the most destabilizing because it attacks the mind's sense of safety. The shift, genuine spiritual maturity, leads not to more answers, but to a profound peace with mystery. The more conscious you become, the more you realize the inherent limits of the rational mind. Certainties, once armor, are revealed to be prisons of dogma. The manifestation: old, strongly held opinions about spirituality, politics, purpose, or life after death begin to dissolve. You can no longer crystallize a belief before it dissolves into a question. A physicist Jung treated, for example, found his scientific certainties shattered, replaced by a deep wonder about everything. The outcome: you enter what Jung recognized as the cloud of unknowing. You develop the capacity to hold paradox, to believe contradictory things simultaneously without needing resolution. You become able to act decisively while remaining open to being completely wrong. Truth is no longer a concept to be caged, but a living flow to be experienced. 5. The habit of blame. The fifth quid is the hardest for the ego to surrender: blame. This involves quitting not just the blaming of others, but the entire victim-perpetrator narrative that gives meaning, and often identity, to suffering. The shift, spiritual growth, involves a radical shift in how you relate to your wounds. You move from seeing yourself as a victim of external forces to a participant in a larger pattern of your own creation, conscious or unconscious. The manifestation: this process moves through stages, from intense rage at the unfairness, to the recognition of recurring patterns, to the eventual, agonizing realization of your own unconscious participation in the situations you most blame others for. The ultimate step is taking radical responsibility for your experience. The outcome: quitting blame means reclaiming your ultimate power. The woman who quit blaming her ex-husband for her pain found freedom not because he was suddenly proven innocent, but because she recognized that holding on to the blame was her choice, a way to avoid her own responsibility for her life. The individuated person sees that even wounds serve awakening and refuses to give others the power to define their story. 6. Spiritual bypassing. The sixth quid is deceptively subtle and common in modern spirituality: spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual concepts to avoid genuine human and psychological experience. The shift: it is a realization that you have been using heaven to escape earth. Meditation, affirmations, and concepts like "everything happens for a reason" or "we're all one" become elaborate defense mechanisms against grief, anger, boundaries, and difficult psychological work. The manifestation: a long-time meditator, for example, comes to realize that despite profound transcendent states, their human relationships are disasters and their emotions are numbed. They have to come back down into their body, their feelings, and their very human needs and desires. The outcome: the creation of spiritual maturity. This is the ability to be fully human and fully spiritual simultaneously. You can have clear boundaries despite knowing we're all one. You can feel legitimate anger despite understanding everyone's doing their best. You are living at the intersection where the infinite meets the intimate. 7. The isolation of awakening. The final quid counters the myth of the solitary sage, the isolation of awakening. Early on, isolation feels necessary. You feel too conscious, too different, too deep to connect with those who are asleep. The shift: This isolation, Jung observed, eventually reveals itself to be a form of spiritual pride and a profound fear of intimacy, a protection against being seen in your own struggles, your very non-enlightened, messy humanity. The manifestation, the subtle arrogance of being more conscious, dissolves. You realize you can connect with anyone, not by lowering your consciousness, but by embracing your shared humanity. You can be with unconscious people without judgment because you recognize your own unconscious patterns. The outcome, genuine spiritual maturity, leads back to conscious relationship. This is the ability to connect without merging, to love without attachment, and to share truth without preaching. You are not quitting connection, you are quitting the unconscious, desperate need for merging, creating space for the rare and precious conscious community of other souls who are also courageously quitting the false to embrace the true. 8. Attachment to outcomes. This is where spiritual awakening tests the ego most deeply. Beneath the surface desire for control lies the subtle craving for things to unfold according to our script. We cling to outcomes because they promise us safety, validation, or significance. Yet this very clinging becomes the root of suffering. To quit this attachment does not mean you become passive or indifferent. On the contrary, you act with full presence, full courage, and full intention. But you release the psychological addiction to results. You no longer demand that life reward you according to your terms. Jung described the individuated person as someone who can engage with the world without needing the ego's guarantees, someone who embodies the principle, do what is right, and let go of the rest. This quitting is liberation. All the energy that was once bound in worry, obsession, and disappointment becomes available for creativity, love, and presence. You find yourself moving with greater freedom, less weighed down by fear of failure or hunger for validation. It is the difference between being chained to outcomes and dancing with possibilities. 9. The need to convert or save others. In the early stages of awakening, there is a burning urgency to pull others into the light you've discovered. You want your friends, family, and the entire world to wake up with you. But beneath this impulse often hides judgment and subtle arrogance, the belief that you see what others cannot. Over time, the awakened person quits this need. You realize that awakening is not a crusade but a personal unfolding. Every soul has its own rhythm, its own timing, its own lessons to endure. To interfere with that process is not compassion but control. Jung taught that the unconscious ripens only when it is ready, and forcing insight upon others can wound rather than heal. The deeper wisdom is this: your greatest teaching is not in your words but in your being. When you embody truth, you naturally radiate it. You no longer pity those asleep or try to argue them awake. Instead, you respect their path as sacred. Judgment dissolves into compassion, and missionary zeal transforms into quiet example. This is how awakening matures, from preaching to presence. 10. The isolation of awakening. One of the most subtle traps of the spiritual path is isolation. The more conscious you become, the more alien the world can seem. You may withdraw, convinced that no one can understand you. On the surface, it looks like purity, keeping your energy protected. But beneath it often lies fear, fear of intimacy, fear of vulnerability, fear of being touched by the messiness of human relationship. This withdrawal creates a paradox: you gain awareness but lose connection. Jung warned of this shadow in Spiritual Development, where awakening becomes a defense against the pain of being human. Maturity, however, leads you back into relationship, but of a different quality. Not the unconscious merging of the old self, not the shallow connections built on masks and roles, but a new kind of bond, conscious connection. You quit both extremes, the need to dissolve into others and the need to stand apart in superiority. Instead, you learn to be fully self-contained and fully present with others at the same time. This is the birth of conscious community, a rare meeting of souls who are awake, sovereign, and yet deeply connected. It is not isolation, and it is not codependence. It is the sacred middle ground where presence meets presence, and awakening becomes a shared fire rather than a lonely torch. The nature of the quit. This process is a death and rebirth of identity. It takes time, courage, and enormous self-compassion. You will quit and return. You will release and grip again. This is not failure, it is the spiral nature of growth. Each time you return to an old pattern, your attachment to it is a little looser. Jung's ultimate teaching here is that you are not losing yourself, you are finding yourself. Every release is a revelation. Every letting go is a coming home.